So I want to start off with a question. How many of you guys have ever ended up somewhere you never intended to be, and it's seemingly you get there and it was of no fault of your own? You feel like you didn't, sometimes you just end up in a bad spot and you can look back and you say, okay, yeah, I made a really stupid decision. I really shouldn't have done this. This was not wise for me to do. But sometimes we go about with the best of intentions and we try to do the right thing and we still end up in this crappy situation and we wonder how we got there and why. We can't figure it out. Sometimes with the best of intentions, we end up places we didn't mean to end up. And I was thinking about this, and I was trying to come up with examples from my own life, and there are several. But I thought of one that I shared, actually, I shared with the worship team just a few weeks ago, about the time I almost accidentally signed up for the Marines. And so, see, you guys that know me are laughing because there's nothing more anti-Marine than this right here. And especially, even more so, because I was in my senior year of high school. And some of you guys knew me when I was in high school. Some of you didn't, but I was very much a punk rock kid. Authority rubbed me the wrong way. It didn't even matter if what you're saying made sense. If you were an authority, I just had this natural urge to defy. And so some of you guys, especially you guys who've been in the military, were like, yeah, he should have gone. It would have beat some of that out of him probably. But so I was in my senior year of high school, and I was trying to get into this school music performance program. And so I went up and I auditioned. I didn't make it in, and I hadn't really given it much thought to what I was going to do if I didn't make it in. It wasn't that I thought I was a shoo-in or anything like that, but I had no direction. I didn't know where I was going to go, and that just seemed a good idea as any. So when I didn't make it in, I kind of had this little void of direction. I didn't know what I was going to do. And so my dad started, as dads are wont to do, started riding me a little bit about what I was going to do once I graduated. And so if you're 17, 18, I don't know how they get your number, but you start getting recruiters calling your house, and they start asking for you. And so one guy, I had gotten in a fight with my dad, and I got a call later that day. My dad was really pushing me. You should really think about military. You should think about military. You should think about military. And I was like, Dad, I'm not doing the military. But we'd gotten in this fight, and I was particularly exhausted. So I get a phone call that day, and they asked for me, and it's a recruiter from the Marines. And I was just particularly exhausted with the argument. And so I said, you know what? I'll get a brochure. I'll show it to my dad. Maybe that'll shut him up for at least a month if I just show them that I pursued and got some information. And so if you guys are in the military and you work with these recruiters, you guys know that they're tenacious because they got numbers to make. And so I said, he said, would you ever think about joining the armed forces? And I was like, no, I'm a musician. Well, we got a band. And I was like, I don't really want to be in your band. And they're like, well, have you ever thought? I said, well, I don't know. I thought, I work for my church, or I do that. Oh, you could be a chaplain. And I'm like, no, I don't really want to do that either. And finally, I was like, well, you know what? You just got a brochure or something? They said, yeah. What time are you going to be home tomorrow? I'll swing by. I'll chat. I'll give you something. And I'm thinking, I could really want to get Dad off my back. Let's do it. So I go, he shows up. I'm going to try to make a long story short. I made all kinds of mistakes. He was a Marine recruiter. I accidentally called him my Army recruiter. They don't like it when you do that. If you mix up the Army and the Marines, they get apparently real upset. So he was offended when I did that. But basically, long story short, he ends up putting me in his car. I drive to the recruiter office. We take the pre-ASVAB, whatever it is. I get all the questions right. He comes back down. He slides something in front of me. He's like, all right, well, if you sign this, we'll get everything going. And I said, all I wanted was a brochure. And he was really mad because I had let him take me everywhere and do all the testing and everything else, and he thought I was ready to sign. And so, but it was just all I wanted was a brochure. I end up somewhere I didn't mean to be. And so hopefully you guys can relate. Sometimes it's not a dumb decision that we make, although that's debatable in my case. But sometimes through the best of intentions, we end up somewhere we never intended to be to begin with. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit today. I'm happy this is the last week of our Dr. Seuss series. I'm not happy about that. I'm happy that I got to speak one more time. Because unlike Mike, who the last couple weeks stood up here and said, I've never read a Dr. Seuss book in my life, I loved Dr. Seuss. And if you were here a couple weeks ago when I preached on Yertle the Turtle, I went through the whole why Dr. Seuss is has a special place in my heart, how it's so timeless, everything from Green Eggs and Ham being the first book that I learned to read all the way through, to my mom giving me a copy of Oh, the Places You'll Go when I graduated high school. Dr. Seuss has just always had a warm spot in my heart. And we talked before, let's see, who remembers the poetic meter that Dr. Seuss used that I explained a few weeks ago? Anybody? What's it called? It's anapestic tetrameter. So shame on you guys for not remembering. It's something only an English major like me would have known. But we talk about why Dr. Seuss is so timeless. We say, well, it's because of the rhythmic meter that he used or the art that he used. And so it's fun, and every generation kind of falls in love with it all over again. But I honestly, those things are cool. And again, being a recovering English major, I maybe nerd out on those a little more than I should. But I really think what makes him so timeless is his characters and the messages that he gets across with his stories that he writes. And so we're going to be talking about another one of my favorite stories of his. A few weeks ago, I got to talk to you about a turtle with delusions of grandeur, thought he was king of everything that I could see. We're going to go the other direction today, and we're going to talk to you about an elephant who is faithful 100%. And so we're going to be talking about Horton hatches the egg. And so we're going to be looking at that this morning and really talking about faithfulness. Horton is such a great character, and I'm going to come back to that. But I think the best way to really get an idea of who this character of Horton is by just jumping right into the story. And so again, like Yertle, I would love to sit up here and just read the book cover to cover, but unfortunately we don't have enough time. So I'm just going to read the beginning to you guys, just so we're all on the same page for anybody, like if there's any other Mike Pumphreys out there who never read a Dr. Seuss book in your life. First off, I'm sorry. And second off, we want to all be on the same page. So this is how Horton hatches the egg starts. Sighed Maisie, a lazy bird hatching an egg. I'm tired and I'm bored and I've kinks in my leg. From just sitting here day after day. It's work, how I hate it. I'd much rather play. I'd take a vacation, fly off for a rest, if I could find someone to stay on my nest. If I could find someone, I'd fly away free. Then Horton, the elephant, passed by her tree. Hello, called the lazy bird, smiling her best. You've nothing to do and I need a rest. Would you like to sit on the egg in my nest? The elephant laughed, why of all silly things, I haven't feathers and I haven't wings. Me on your egg, why that doesn't make sense. Your egg is so small, ma'am, and I'm so immense. Tut, tut, answered Maisie, I know you're not small, but I'm sure you can do it, no trouble at all. Just sit on it softly, you're gentle and kind. Come, be a good fellow, I know you won't mind. I can't, said the elephant. Please, begged the bird. I won't be gone long, sir, I give you my word. I'll hurry right back, why I'll never be missed. Very well, said the elephant, since you insist. You want a vacation, go fly off and take it. I'll sit on your egg, and I'll try not to break it. I'll stay and be faithful, I mean what I say. Toodaloo, sang out Maisie, and fluttered away. Horton's a cool dude. Horton is about as sweet and friendly and loyal of a character as I've read in any of Seuss's books. And this isn't the only the only story we see Horton in. What's the other story we see Horton in? Horton Hears a Who, right? Where he discovers this small universe of people that nobody else really thinks is important or believes is significant. And Horton has a catchphrase that he uses in that story. Do you guys remember the catchphrase? Very close. A person's a person, no matter how small. And so that's just running theme throughout Horton Hears a Who. And we have a running theme in this book as well. And he has a catchphrase. He says, an elephant's faithful 100%. So some of you guys can maybe see the end coming already. Horton's a nice guy who wanted to do the right thing and through no fault of his own ends up in a situation that he didn't intend to be in. And so this bird who flew off just to take a short rest ends up going to Palm Beach and not coming back. And so Horton ends up in a tree on a nest, which he has to support. He has to put look like crutches under the tree to support his weight. And so he sits on this egg, and it's not an easy task, especially for an elephant. And all kinds of things happen while Maisie's on her trip. He sits there for a full year, and so we have thunder and lightning and rain, and he's sick, and they go through the winter, and we have snow, and icicles are hanging off of his trunk. And then we go through into the spring, and the weather's nice, and all of his friends come by, and they see an elephant sitting up in a tree, which is just an absurd, ridiculous thing. And so they all start poking fun at him and insulting him and saying, hey, why don't you just come play with us? And Horton says, no, an elephant's faithful 100%. I said what I meant. I'm going to sit here on this egg. And so they leave, and so he becomes desperately lonely because all of his friends have left him. And then eventually some hunters come along, and they capture him, tree and all, and they sell him off to a traveling circus where everybody can go look at the ridiculous sight of an elephant sitting up in a tree on a bird's nest. And through this entire time, Horton is faithful 100%. Through the insults, through the trials, through the weather, through getting captured and sold. He is faithful 100%. So I have kind of an odd question. How many of you guys can relate? How many of you guys can relate to an elephant sitting in a tree being captured by and sold to a traveling circus? I think we all end up through the best of intentions in places that we didn't mean to be. And so we can look at it as ridiculous of a story as this and see ourselves in Horton a little bit. Horton was just trying to do the right thing, and he ended up getting the raw deal. And I think that reminds us of times we get in situations we didn't plan on being in. But I think sometimes God challenges us to walk through seasons that are tough and walk through things that are challenging, and that by being faithful through those seasons, God is ultimately glorified and people come to know him through how we weather those seasons. And so just like Yertle, as I was reading this story, I was reminded of another story out of the Bible about a young guy named Daniel. And if you grew up in the church, you probably know about Daniel because it's one of those stories the Sunday school teachers love to go through and talk about. But if you didn't grow up in the church, we're going to get you caught up real quick. So we're going to flip to the book of Daniel. It's in the Old Testament, so if you're not familiar, it's in the first half of your Bible. And it's kind of a small book. It's after Ezekiel. It's only about, I think, 12 chapters long. So it's kind of short. If you reach Hosea, have you gone too far? If you don't have a Bible with you, we do have the YouVersion app, and it will be up on the screen behind me. Again, if you're not familiar with the Church of the Bible, the best part of the Bible that God wrote was the table of contents right in the beginning. So if you need to find Daniel, thanks for that groan, I appreciate it. If you need to find Daniel, you can look there. But again, it'll be behind me on the screen. And so we're going to look at the book of Daniel, and we're going to start right at the very beginning, Daniel chapter 1, verse 1. And so there's a lot of super Jewish names in this, so if I mispronounce something, I apologize if you took Hebrew in seminary. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. So at the very beginning, just to give you guys some context in case you're not familiar, we have this land called Judah. It's where the chosen people of God, the Israelites, the Jewish people are. And there's this long back and forth where the people are following what God says, and then they kind of forget, and they kind of drift, and they kind of whatever. And so God would release his blessing, release his protection, and inevitably they'd go get conquered by some tribe or another until they finally went back to God and cried out and asked for deliverance, and he would come and he would send somebody to deliver them. So what happens is that's what's going on right here at the beginning, is that the kingdom of Judea, where the Israelites are, has been taken over by a foreign land, by this king of Babylon named Nebuchadnezzar. And so in verse 3, then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring in some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. So he goes around and says, find some of these Jewish young men that are incredibly smart, the cream of the crop. I want you to bring them to my palace. We're going to train them in the ways of Babylon. So the king, in verse 5, the king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. So immediately Daniel's plucked up from his home, from everything that he knew, brought to a foreign land that's culturally very, very, very different from Judea, where he's from. And he knows immediately he's going to be there at least how long? At least 3 years, right? That's just the training, what it's going to take for him to get educated. The on-the-job training is going to take 3 years. Verse 6, among these were some from Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, which those names may not mean much, but you may recognize them in a minute. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar, which we're going to keep Daniel. To Hananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach. And to Azariah, Abednego. So again, if you're a Sunday school nerd, if you grew up in the church, you do know Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That's a little bit of foreshadowing. So Daniel and these 3 guys are among those that are collected and taken to Babylon. And so that's where we're going to stop there for a minute. So if you're not familiar, they're taken from Judea and they're taken into this country of Babylon. Babylon culturally could not be more different than Judea. Being somebody who worshiped God in Babylon was the equivalent of being an elephant who was sitting on a nest in a tree. Look completely out of place, completely out of your element, completely out of your context, and God has allowed this to happen. So Daniel and his buddies, they are stuck in this situation that they don't want to be in, that they didn't do anything to find themselves in, and yet they're stuck there for a period of time, we know, to begin with, at least 3 years. It ends up being significantly longer than that. But Daniel he's kind of in a spot, feeling an awful lot like an elephant of a tree, completely out of place. But Daniel does not allow this influence from Babylon and these other things to keep him from being faithful. If you read through, we're not going to be able to read through the entire book of Daniel, but if you read through, he maintains the Jewish dietary laws, even when everybody's trying to get him not to. He continues to worship God, even though nobody else in Babylon does, and they have all their other gods, and there's a lot of pressure to worship those gods. The king has all these dreams that he can't interpret, and so God shows Daniel what those dreams mean. And so when he shows up before the king and interprets the dreams, and the king wants to give Daniel all the glory and the praise, Daniel says, actually, it wasn't me. God showed me these dreams. There's a God who unlocks mysteries like these and told me to tell you what this dream means. And so no matter what's done, Daniel remains faithful. And so he does not allow the culture and the context around him, the struggles, the situation that he's walking through to compromise what he believes and to compromise the relationship that he has with his God. And so he's faithful 100%, just like Horton in the character. In the story. And there's a lot that goes on to, a lot that we're going to be skipping over just for the sake of time, unfortunately. But Daniel was in a situation he didn't ask to be in. It would have been incredibly easy to be bitter, to be upset, to be resentful towards God for the situation that he found himself in. It's so easy to focus on those circumstances. Those three guys, the three friends of his, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, if you know the story, they get thrown into a big oven because they refuse to follow the Babylonian laws. And that, spoiler alert, they're okay. But so Daniel's looking around at all these things happening, and it would have been so easy for him to just throw up his hands and say, I'm sick of it. I'm just going to go along to get along because I'm tired of being in this situation that I didn't do anything to be put in to begin with. And I feel like that's an easy response for us to get to, right? When we find ourselves in places that we didn't intend to be in, it's so easy to just throw up our hands and say, God, I don't know what you're doing, but I'm done. I'm checked out. When you're ready to set things right, let me know. But in the meantime, I'm just going to sit here and get bitter. I'm going to sit here and grumble. I'm going to sit here and feel sorry for myself and complain to anybody who's going to listen. And so it's such an easy response for us to fall into. But we look at characters like Daniel that was really, again, in a really tough spot by no fault of his own and manages to maintain that faithfulness. And the important thing to remember is that the king that Daniel interprets his dreams for him, when he interprets the dreams, nobody else in the land was able to do it. As a matter of fact, he was getting ready to put all the wise men to death because he was sick and tired of no one being able to tell him what his dream meant. And so when Daniel steps up and says, I can do it, not only does he save his friends and all the other people that were there in the palace that were about to be put to death, but he introduces the king there to this God that Daniel has worshipped, this God that Daniel has known his entire life. And so because of Daniel's faithfulness, now he's pointing other people to God because of how he weathers that situation. And it's important for us to remember the same thing, that when we get put into those situations, how we weather our trials, how we weather the times, the situations that we don't want to be in, tells other people a lot about our relationship with God and how that plays out in our day-to-day life. Super, super important. Because, again, Daniel being a Jew in Babylon was just like an elephant sitting in a tree, and it draws a lot of attention. And so people were looking to see how he was weathering this trial. We're going to fast forward a bit just to prove how much people were looking at Daniel. We're going to fast forward to chapter 6. We're only moving ahead 6 chapters. But in verse 1, it says, chapter 6, verse 1, it pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom. The first question you should have is, who the heck is Darius? I thought we just left Nebuchadnezzar 6 chapters ago. Darius is at least 2 kings later. And at this point, Daniel's been in Babylon about 80 years. So he gets plucked out. It goes from 3 years of training. Now he's been in this situation he never wanted to be in. He's been there 80 years. How many of you guys get thrown into a situation and you're still there 80 years later? Well, I'm looking around. None of you guys, to be honest. But hypothetically, the situations that we find ourselves in generally resolve themselves much quicker than that, unfortunately, or fortunately. But Daniel at this point has been in Babylon around 80 years. So we're going to continue to read. This is the story, if you grew up in the church, that you'll be the most familiar with Daniel. So again, in verse 1, it pleased Darius, who's now the king at this time, to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. So these were people that were in charge of the different groups and be able to help manage everything. Wise men, administrators, to help carry the load of the king. So, and Daniel, verse 3, now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. So now not only has Daniel been weathering this situation, Daniel's actually flourishing. He's prospering in this land, not because he decided to give up what he had come with, but because of how faithful he was. Because of his faithfulness, we're now seeing Daniel's really flourishing and growing and about to be put over the entire kingdom as somebody who was not even from that land. And so at this, verse 4, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. I love this. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. How awesome is that? If somebody wanted to find dirt on you, how hard would they have to dig to find it? I know personally, probably not as far as I'd like. But here it says this about Daniel, that they tried as hard as they could, but they were unable to find anything. Again, they found no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and he was neither corrupt nor negligent. Just shows you the kind of guy Daniel was. Again, not unlike Horton, the character of Horton that we have in Seuss's story. Finally, in verse 5, these men said, "We'll never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God." So they knew that Daniel was not going to trip up. There was no way they could get him in trouble unless somehow they were able to pit him and God against each other. That was the only way they were going to get him to trip up, because they knew that was what was most important to him. So in verse 6, the administrators and the satraps went as a group to the king and said, "O King Darius, live forever," sucking up. "The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or man during the next 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be thrown into a lion's den. Now, O king, issue the decree and in accordance with the laws of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed." So King Darius put the decree in writing. Wouldn't you? These guys come up to you and they say, "Oh, King Darius, you are the man. You are the king over everything. You're the greatest. You're glorious. You deserve all of our honor and praise. As a matter of fact, you should put it into law that nobody can even worship any other god but you for 30 days. And of course, they build his ego up. They put him in this position. He goes, "Yeah, actually, that sounds pretty good. Just 30 days. I could get away with being worshipped for 30 days. That'd be pretty cool." And so he puts this into law and not really thinking, and we find out in a minute, not really thinking through exactly how this was going to pan out. And so we're going to skip ahead. Oh, wait, did I get it all? Yeah, no, so King Darius put the decree in writing. Now, unfortunately, they do this, and of course, these men put this into place because they knew that Daniel, there was no way he was going to go 30 days without praying to or worshiping his God. And so they set a trap, and it says Daniel, hearing the decree, didn't change a thing. He still worshiped God the way that he always had in his home with his windows open, fully in public for everyone to see. And so Daniel decided he was not going to change a thing. He was going to be faithful 100%. And so, of course, they had set this trap for him. This was the whole point of the entire thing. And so the other administrators and the other the satraps, they come, they see him praying, and they immediately go to Darius and they say, "Your boy Daniel broke the law. You need to throw him in the den." And immediately, it says Darius was heartbroken, and he didn't want to do it, and he looked for way after way after way to keep Daniel from getting thrown into the lion's den. But because he had written in this decree into law, and that it was not able to be broken or changed, his hands were tied, and so they end up having to throw Daniel into the lion's den, even though he does not want to. And so we're going to skip ahead one more time to verse 16. And so verse 16. Oh, there we are. So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you." So again, we see Darius's heart here. He had no desire for Daniel to come to any harm. As a matter of fact, this is another situation of somebody who got themselves into a situation that they weren't expecting, they didn't want to find themselves in. And so a stone, verse 17, a stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. Verse 20. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions?" And his voice is anguished because he does not hold out a hope that this has actually happened. These lions were kept hungry for a reason. This was not just where they kept the lions. This was a punishment. This was how they executed people. The lions were kept hungry so that when you put somebody in the den, they did not come out the next morning. And so he calls out in an anguished voice, hope against hope, because he does not really hold out much hope of hearing anything back. However, in verse 21, Daniel answered, "O king, live forever." He's not even upset about the situation, doesn't even hold it against him. Verse 22, "My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done any wrong before you, O king." Verse 23, the king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him because he had trusted in his God. And I almost didn't include this verse, but it made me laugh, so I did. Verse 24, at the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den, along with their wives and children. And before they reached the floor, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Yikes. So in case there was any doubt that the lions were actually hungry, it says that the people who were thrown in after Daniel never made it to the floor. They were tossed in, and before they hit the ground, boom, bones crushed, devoured. And so we have the situation with Daniel. And if you go on and continue to read, King Darius ends up issuing a decree throughout all of Babylon talking about Daniel's God and how he deserved to be worshipped and he deserved to be revered. And so he writes this decree that he sends out to everybody. And so once again, because of Daniel's faithfulness, other people are now turning and seeing who God is and giving him glory because of Daniel's faithfulness. I think we find ourselves in those similar situations, not in a lion's den per se, but we find ourselves daily put into situations where we have to decide what compromises do we make. We know where God's leading, we know what God has called us to do, but what compromises do we make as we go through? And as we look at characters like Horton, although of course, look at Daniel, we look at his buddies that were thrown into the oven. If you go back a couple chapters, Daniel's a really cool book if you're looking for an Old Testament book with a lot of action. It's a really cool book to read. But they're thrown into the furnace, they survive. We see time and time and time again that people who are faithful, that their faithfulness causes others to glorify God. Now hear what I'm not saying. Some people will stand up and tell you that when you're walking through a trial, if you're faithful, that God's really, really going to bless you on the other side. And I want you to hear me very carefully, because that's not what I'm saying. Daniel was faithful. He had lived in Babylon for 80 years. He did everything that God had asked him to. And what was the blessing that he received? Not being eaten by lions. Some of you guys walked in here today, you didn't realize you were blessed. But if you haven't been eaten by lions today, you're blessed. And so this was the blessing that was awaiting Daniel, was not being murdered by hungry lions. What we do see because of Daniel's faithfulness is people who were watching, people who were looking and seeing how does Daniel weather this situation and what does God do in response, caused other people to turn and glorify God. And that we see time and time again throughout Scripture. Horton, at the end of the story, ends up the egg that he'd been sitting on for over a year. He ends up, that traveling circus goes right through Palm Beach, and they find Maisie, who has been sitting there, and all of a sudden the egg starts to hatch, and she wants it back because all the hard work has been done, right? And then out of the egg pops a tiny little elephant with wings, a tiny little Horton. And so Horton was, in a sense, rewarded for his faithfulness as well. But I am not comfortable standing up in here and saying that if you're walking through a trial, if you're faithful, God's got some huge blessing on the other side for you. But I will say that through your obedience, if you are faithful through these times that we have to walk through, that God is going to be glorified and that people are going to come to know him because of your faithfulness. And in a sense, that's a huge blessing to be able to know that you are a part of that. Because just like the Jews who were taken out of Judea and put into Babylon, every bit as much, if you are a follower of Jesus and if you're actively pursuing what he wants for your life, you're every bit out of your element here in America as an elephant in a nest in a tree. Sometimes we don't feel that way. It's real easy to get swept into this tide of cultural Christianity. But how much of what's around us in culture just speaks incredibly against what we read in the Bible? Consumerism, materialism, greed, judgment, condemnation. All these things that we see in culture, that not just outside, but from within the church that we see played out in culture, just are in such a stark contrast to what we actually read when you open this Bible and you read through it. And so if you are living out a relationship with Jesus, if you're living out your faith in the way that this says, you are going to be like an elephant in a tree. You're going to be different. You're going to be somewhat different. And as we're getting ready to close, I'm going to call the band up and we're going to continue. I want you to flip to the New Testament now if you are using a Bible. It's 1 Peter. 1 Peter chapter 2 is where we're going. And 1 Peter is similar to where we just came from in the Old Testament, because in the Old Testament the Jews were taken over and they were spread out and they were into countries that they weren't from. And the book of 1 Peter, we're fast forwarding a couple thousand years, but the situations are very similar. Here, instead of Jews, we have Christians, but we have Christians that were experiencing persecution, and so they were scattered. They were being persecuted, and so they left. And so Peter wrote this letter to Christians that were scattered. They were outside of their context. They were no longer surrounded by their family and friends and the people that the other Christians that were culturally the same as them. And so they found themselves in a place where they were elephants in trees. And so Peter writes this letter to those people as an encouragement. And so when we pick up 1 Peter chapter 2, we're going to start verse 9. Verse 9. And this is Peter writing a letter to those Christians that find themselves in cultures that don't value Jesus at all. This is what he says. But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people belonging to God, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness and into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. So first, he reminds you who you are. Peter says, yeah, you may feel like an elephant up in a tree. You're so out of place here. But you're part of God's family. You're his holy nation. You're his priesthood. And so he encourages, reminds you who you are. Once you were not a people, now you're the people of God. You had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. And then this is the encouragement he gives them. Dear friends, I urge you as aliens and strangers in the world to abstain from sinful desires which war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. So it sounds like Daniel, right? They tried to find something they could accuse him of. They tried to find something they could trip him up, and he said they couldn't because of the character that he had. And so this is exactly the same thing that Peter is urging the Christians, and what ultimately we can take as an encouragement for ourselves. Because here we are elephants in trees. Again, if you're truly living out what the Bible challenges and what Jesus has called us to do, you're going to feel like an elephant in a tree. And so we can take this same encouragement to ourselves. Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day that he visits us. So what does Peter say? The same thing I've been saying. They're going to see how you weather this situation. They're looking to you. They're looking at you, and it doesn't say you're going to be blessed. It says they will glorify God because of your faithfulness. And so I say this from one elephant in a tree to a bunch of elephants in trees. Whatever situation you may be going through right now, and that's what I ask. What is God asking you to be faithful in? What situation do you find yourself in right now that maybe you're not happy about? Maybe you kind of, if you'll be honest with yourself, have done some grumbling, some complaining, a little bit of bitterness because you're not happy with where God has you right now. But what if in that situation God is calling you to be faithful 100%? What if by walking through this, other people are going to come to know Him and to glorify Him as a result of your faithfulness? And so as we're going to close out in worship this morning, just be reminded that there are people watching you. And how do you know what that looks like? How do you know what that faithfulness looks like? What does it mean to live such good lives among the pagans? That's what this is for, guys. I love Awaken because we have people that have are here this morning that maybe this is the first time they've stepped into a church or a building. And then we have people that have been following God for decades. But I'm surprised by the number of Christians that I talk to that they say they don't hear God speak. They say they don't know where to go. They don't know what the direction is. They're trying to find, and they just don't read this. And I promise you, I say this with no judgment or no condemnation because I'm one of them. I'm not in this near as much as I should be. But that's my challenge for you this morning. What situation do you find yourself in that God is asking you to be faithful? He's asking you to weather that trial. He's asking you to just be faithful and obedient through the time that He's called you so that somebody else may, seeing your good deeds, seeing your faithfulness, and seeing your obedience, come to glorify God. And so as we close in worship together this morning, that's my challenge, what we reflect on this morning.